holiday, and there are grapevines everywhere. This was in 2018, and Brian and I both had long service leave, so we had 6 weeks, which was amazing. And as part of the holiday, we went to Europe. I've never been to Europe before. And we had a 3-day bike ride in Germany. We rode from Mainz to Koblenz along the Rhine River. And it was just amazing. Looking back, it's even more amazing given that no one can go anywhere much at the moment. And as we rode along the river, there were vines everywhere. I've got a few photos to share with you. Some are just gratuitous holiday snaps because we can't do anything like this at the moment. So there's a couple of photos that should come up on the screen. And this is just where we were, just for fun. But as well as having lots of fun, there were vines on either side of the river as we rode along. So you should be able to see the steep hills in a moment. The hills were unbelievably steep, and there were vines on either side. Can we have the next lot of photos, Jen? Thank you. So it's a bit hard to see, but behind Brian and me, there are vines on the steep hills. I don't know how they harvested because the hills were so steep, but it was really beautiful. And for anyone who lives in the Rhine Valley, this metaphor, this image of the grapevine and the branches and the fruit would be so meaningful for them because it would be part of their everyday life. And I think for the disciples as well, who lived in an agrarian society, they would have really related to this image. But I think even for us, we can still really identify with the image and the picture that Jesus uses here. So just to clarify all the bits of the image, in verse 1, Jesus says, I am the true vine and my Father is the gardener. And then in verse 5, I am the vine, you are the branches. So Jesus is the vine, God the Father is the gardener, and all those who trust in Jesus are branches in the vine. Now, not only does Jesus say that he's the vine, he says he is the true vine. And so this contrast picks up the Old Testament use of this image where Israel was the vine. And in the Old Testament, the vine of Israel consistently failed to produce the fruit that God was looking for in her. Isaiah 5 makes this really clear, verse 7. The vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel, and the people of Judah are the vines he delighted in. And he looked for justice, but saw bloodshed, for righteousness, but heard cries of distress. So Jesus contrasts himself with Israel. In fact, he replaces Israel as the vine of God. Israel was the vine who failed. Jesus is the true vine who will not fail, the vine who will produce the fruit that God is looking for. Now, you might have noticed as Danielle read the passage, there are a few key ideas in this passage that kind of keep being repeated. They all kind of connect with each other and inform each other. And some of those repeated ideas that I picked up were about bearing fruit, about remaining in Jesus, keeping Jesus' commands, loving one another, and about answered prayer. So we're just going to look at some of those repeated and key ideas in this passage now. So first of all, bearing fruit. It's kind of obvious, isn't it, that the whole purpose of a vine is to produce grapes, to bear fruit. No fruit means no wine. That's a bit of a tragedy for an owner of a vineyard and for any wine drinkers among us. So John 15 makes it very clear how important and necessary it is for the branches in the vine of Jesus to also produce fruit. Just as important as it is for a grapevine to produce fruit, we are called to produce fruit for Jesus. So in verse 8 we see this. This is to my Father's glory, that you bear much fruit, showing yourselves to be my disciples. And again in verse 16, I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last. So it's our job as people who belong to Jesus, as people chosen by God to bear fruit for him. And we're going to hold on thinking about what that fruit is for a little while. Because the real emphasis of this passage is on how we can be sure that we will be fruitful. One of the ways we can be fruitful is by allowing God, the gardener, to prune our lives. John mentions that in verse 2. I'm just going to flag this now.
because the real emphasis of the passage isn't on God pruning, but on us actively working to bear fruit for God. But just keep that in mind, and you can think about it later, chat to me later, or maybe tease out that idea in your Connect groups if you're looking at this passage. But the emphasis, as I said, is on how we can actively work to bear fruit for God. And we do that, first of all, by remaining in Jesus. There's two words that really appear often in this passage. One is bearing fruit, and that appears 9 times. The other is remaining, and that appears 11 times in the passage. So John really wants us to hear this, remain. Now, I don't know about you, but remain seems a pretty passive word to me. It doesn't necessarily seem to be a very positive word. So when I think about people remaining or things remaining, I think about my son remaining on the couch for longer than I had anticipated. I think about the dirty socks remaining on the living room floor. I think about the cobwebs remaining on our windows at home. Clearly, remaining isn't a positive thing for me in our home. But in this passage, the word's used a little bit differently. Here, remain is actually a really active thing to do. It requires us to do something, and it's a really positive word. Jesus urges us to remain in him as he also remains in us. So there's a sense in which we are to be totally and inextricably linked with Jesus and with the life that he gives us. Just like the branches of a vine can't be separated from the vine itself and stay alive, we are to remain connected with Jesus. So how do we do that? How do we remain in Jesus so that we bear fruit in our lives? How do we stay organically connected with Jesus? Let's have a look at verse 7. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory that you bear much fruit. So us remaining in Jesus is linked with his words remaining in us. And that in turn leads to us bearing much fruit. So I guess the question is for us, do Jesus' words remain in us? Do Jesus' words remain in us? And I think if we want them to, we need to work at that. I think there are many ways that we can do that, but there are some really basic first steps we can take. Coming along to church regularly, being part of a Connect group, trying to find ways of reading the Bible, trying to spend time praying as we read so that we can take on board those words of Jesus. Now, I know you're thinking, well, that's exactly what we would expect you to say. You're just the minister up the front. Of course you want us to come to church. Of course you want us to be in a Connect group. And the lists are still in the foyer if you're interested. Of course you want us to be reading the Bible and praying. But you know what? Those aren't just things that we do for the sake of them. They're not just things we do so we have a church here. Those are great ways of helping Jesus' words to remain in us. Those are great ways of us remaining connected with Jesus. Our world is full of words. There are words everywhere. They come at us thick and fast. Words from the left of politics, words from the right of politics, words from interest groups and lobbyists, words from the media. There are words everywhere. Some of them are really great and helpful words. Some aren't so helpful. But not many of them are words from Jesus. How will the words of Jesus remain in us if we don't make space to hear them? So how are you making space to allow Jesus' words to remain in you? It's not easy. It's a huge challenge. And I get that sometimes we're just trying to get from Monday to Friday and survive with our families and our jobs and everything else that is happening. But let me encourage you. Keep working hard at making space to hear Jesus' words. During Lent this year, I've been reading a book that is a little commentary on Revelation. It's just 2 pages and, say, 10 verses from Revelation that I read each morning. And for me, that's been a lovely new thing that I've been reading to help me understand Revelation, which is kind of a bit weird, as many of you know. So let's keep working hard at sharing resources with each other, sharing what we are doing that helps us to keep hearing Jesus' words. Maybe podcasts you listen to, maybe you've got an audio Bible. Let's share those ideas around so that we can have Jesus' words remaining in us. Don Carson writes this about Jesus' words. Such words must so lodge in the disciples' mind and heart that conformity to Christ, obedience to Christ, is the most natural or supernatural thing in the world. And that brings us to another way that we remain in Jesus in this passage, by remaining in his love. And we remain in his love by keeping his commands. Verse 9, as the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. If you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commands and remain in his love. I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be complete. Now, keeping commands really does not sound very inspiring, does it? And we've sort of had a bit of a conversation about this on the way through COVID. I think lots of us have been really surprised at how compliant Australians have been, how compliant Victorians have been. We've worn masks, we've stayed at home, we haven't gathered. So is John 15 just about following the rules, the way that we've followed the rules during COVID? There are probably some similarities, but I think the huge difference is Jesus' love for us. Jesus' love for us makes keeping his commands very different to following rules in a pandemic, because obedience and love are two ideas that are inextricably linked in this passage. And that interlinking is what makes a vine such a great image, everything intertwined and connected to each other. Now, what really grabs my attention here is that Jesus has kept the Father's commands and remains in his love. Even within the Godhead, there is obedience. Jesus obeys the Father. And so Jesus remains in the Father's love. So Jesus calls us to model our relationship with him on his relationship with the Father. Jesus is calling us to do exactly what he has already done with his Father. Keep Jesus' commands. That's how we remain in his love. And then there's joy. Jesus wants to rejoice in us, and he wants our lives to be full of joy too. Love and joy transform keeping commands and make that very different to just following rules. I want to come back to that quote from Don Carson that I read a bit earlier. Jesus' words must so lodge in the disciples' mind and heart that conformity to Christ, obedience to Christ, is the most natural or supernatural thing in the world. Jesus' words needs to be part of us if we have any chance of keeping his commands. So they're kind of like second nature to us. And again, this organic image of the vine that is alive reminds us that obedience isn't just a dry rule-keeping exercise. It's about life, it's about love, it's about joy. And as well as having Jesus' words as part of us, we can ask for God's help. We can pray, we hear in these passages. There are some beautiful promises here about how God helps us to bear fruit when we ask him for help in prayer. Again, I'm not going to say much about this now, but tease this out in your Connect groups or chat with me later if you like. God backs us in this. If we let Jesus' words remain in us, if we ask him for help, then he will bear fruit in us. So, where are we? If we trust in Jesus, we are each branches in his vine. We're called to bear fruit. We bear fruit by remaining in Jesus. We remain in Jesus, in his love, by keeping his commands. And then Jesus highlights one particular command. Verse 12. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. Love each other. Jesus has already said this that same evening when he washed his disciples' feet in chapter 13. A new command I give you: love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Jesus is really nailing this home with his disciples and also with us. Love each other. How? Love each other as I have loved you. Here we get to the heart of God's message for each of us, for all people. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. That is exactly what Jesus did on the cross. Literally, he gave up his life. He laid it down for his friends and his enemies, for us, so that we might be drawn into his family, drawn into his vine by accepting his love for us. One commentator describes it this way: the eternal divine love reached its complete and unsurpassable expression in the death of Christ, which was at the same time the death of a man for his friends. The death of a man for his friends. That is what Jesus has done for us. And that is what he calls us to do for each other, to love each other, to lay down our lives for each other, to give up something we might want to do for us, some time, so that we can do something for someone else. So St. Hils, I wonder how this looks for us. Lots of you would remember that in 2019, we went through our big journey of fruitfulness vision process. Our leadership team led us through. We had 4 community meetings. We had questions that we thought about. We talked to each other. We listened to each other. One of our learnings was that some people in our St. Hils community felt really loved and included and part of this community. But other people didn't. Other people didn't feel like they were part of it. They felt like they'd never been able to break in. They didn't feel loved in our community. After our first journey of fruitfulness meeting, we thought about who did we want to look like in 2022. And this is one of the things we said. We said that we wanted to be a community that is a diverse, rich, interwoven variety of people across generations, backgrounds and experiences. Easy people and difficult people who need acceptance, belonging with our imperfections and vulnerability. That's kind of a complicated sentence. But basically what we said was we wanted to be a place where all sorts of people belonged, were included. After our 4th community meeting, we said we wanted welcome and connection culture to be central to who we are as a community. We wanted to have rostered teams, welcoming and including people, but we also wanted the whole community to be working on that as part of our DNA, who we are together as a church. We wanted to love each other and we wanted to love newcomers better. It's a huge challenge, isn't it? But I've been so encouraged by how I've seen us doing this. Through last year when we were locked down, I saw so many people working hard to love other members of this community. And this year, as we've come back to church, it's been so encouraging to see people looking out for each other. We've had another number of new people join us at St. Hils. Some joined us last year during lockdown, and so they've only just met us in person this year. And I think they've been welcomed really well. Some of them have told me they felt overwhelmed by being welcomed and included. They've been invited to join Connect Groups, not just by me, but by some of you. So I'm really encouraged, everyone, by how we have been taking this on board, by how we've been working to be a community where we actually do love each other. So I want to encourage us to keep working on this. There is a cost. Anytime I pause what I'm doing to call someone, to love them, to take them a meal, there's a cost. I have to give up something for me. But that is what Jesus did. He laid down his life. He gave something up for us. So be encouraged and let's keep working on that, loving each other, being willing to care for each other. So we who trust in Jesus are each branches in his vine. We're called to bear fruit. We bear fruit by remaining in Jesus. We remain in Jesus in his love by keeping his commands. We keep his commands, particularly by keeping this command to love each other. This whole package deal is how we bear fruit for Jesus. So the $1 million question, what is this fruit that we are meant to be bearing? It's kind of odd, isn't it, that Jesus just doesn't come out and say here, this is what the fruit is. And I think that's because that's not really the point of what Jesus is saying. What he really wants us to hear is remain in me. That's Jesus' big message. Make space to remain in me. And then the fruit will follow. Basically, I think the fruit that Jesus, the vine, grows on us as his branches is all the things that happen in our lives when we keep his commands, when we make space for his words in our lives. Definitely loving each other is one of those fruits. Every big and little way that we love each other. And every other action or word or thought by which we keep Jesus' commands. That is the fruit that God is looking for in us. I'd like to finish now by sharing with you some examples from someone's life who really did bear fruit for Jesus. Lots of you will know this person. This is Don Helmore, who sadly died a couple of weeks ago. He was part of St Hils for most of his life, and he was 94 when he died. So that is a really long history that he has with this church. But let me share a few ways that I saw Don bearing fruit for Jesus. A couple of weeks before he died, I went to see Don in hospital, and he shared with me that his eyes weren't good enough anymore for him to read the Bible. And so I said, Don, what would you like me to read for you from the Bible? He said to me, just read any of Jesus' words. Don loved Jesus' words. He didn't leave long, complicated instructions for his funeral. He just left one thing, a note with the two Bible passages that he wanted us to read. Psalm 139 and the end of 1 Corinthians 15. Fantastic passages. But that's what was important to Don. The words of Jesus, the words of God in the Bible. A few years ago, my mother-in-law was living in Sydney in independent living, but she needed to be in aged care, supported living. And so we helped her move down to Melbourne, and she moved into an aged care centre. And Don lived right there in the independent living part. And Don found out that Val had moved down, that she didn't know anyone, and he offered to go and visit her. Don didn't know Val. He didn't know Brian and I very well. But he loved us and he loved Val by visiting Val. She only lived for a few more months. But Don bore fruit for Jesus in the way that he loved Val. And one more story from lockdown last year. Don lived in his retirement village in an apartment, and there were lots of other people living there. He knew lots of them really well. And through lockdown, Don wrote a poem for every other resident in his set of apartments. It was a different poem for each person, and in each poem he included something about God. And he told me that each person came and spoke to him about their poem, and they talked to him about the God bit of the poem. Just another beautiful way that Don bore fruit for Jesus. Jesus said, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me,